This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
The idea that you can't learn from each other is absurd. There is no science of right and wrong. The person who summed up this view most accurately was that famous philosopher Margaret Thatcher.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
I'm with the philosopher, Dr. Julian Baggini, to talk about his new book, How the World Thinks, A Global History of Philosophy. A global, that's a pretty big sort of a canvas, Julian.
It is fairly broad, yes. It's not narrow, let's put it that way.
It's not. In the book, and we're going to get straight into this, in the book you suggest that departments of philosophy in universities really ought to insert that the adjective Western in front of the word philosophy, because there's a really narrow focus and there is more to it than that. And I think in a way I am probably your ideal reader for this, because that's exactly where I'm coming from, and I do know that it's narrow of me. So I was delighted to explore this, and I'd like to explore this a bit more with you. So unpack that. What's our problem? Why is Western philosophy not to be regarded as the last word?
Well, okay, I think the minimal thing is just to call it Western philosophy. I mean, there's Brian Van Norden and Jay Garfield are two comparative philosophers, meaning they work in more than one tradition. And, they've been long sort of like campaigning for philosophy departments to become more global. And they wrote a very interesting piece in which they kind of said, look, we kind of give up, but just have the honesty to say this is Western philosophy and, qualify it in some way. Even that caused a big stink and people said, no. So why is it? Now, when you say this to people, I think the typical reaction for people not involved in philosophy is how extraordinary that in this day and age, you can have philosophy departments which are just Western. Isn't that purely scandalous? And I think you've got to be a bit more understanding than that. The point is that philosophy, in one sense, is a tradition of thought which started in ancient Greece and belongs to the West. And other traditions which we call philosophy have different histories, and they have different literatures, they have different assumptions, they have different methods. So there is a sense in which these strands are not all doing the same thing. But the point is their overlap in terms of their interests and their methods and their assumptions is strong enough that the idea that you can't learn from each other is absurd. So sure, we're not saying everything should be, you could go so broad as to cover everything equally, but one should at least be open to this, fruitful dialogue with other traditions, I think.
You do make the point that the different philosophies try to do different things. You make a beautiful distinction between philosophies that tell you about how to live and philosophers that try to explain how to know things, and that's a nice sort of distinction.
Well, I should say that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants who are standing on the shoulders of giants. The only way to write a book as broad as this is you don't go out and seek to become an expert on all the world's philosophies. It doesn't work. You basically do some primary research, but you talk a lot to people who really know their stuff. So, I'm drawing together work with different traditions, and the way seeker, truth seeker distinction is not one I made up. It goes back to Roger Ames, and it's a collaborator who I'm shamefully not going to remember the name of. Yes, now it's not about kind of an either or. I think this is, when you're doing comparative philosophy, any kind of comparative study actually, there's always that kind of temptation to think, in Asia it's like this, in Europe it's like that, and in Africa it's something else, to sort of imagine that it's all very different. The opposite temptation is to say, we're all doing the same thing, aren't we really, and to play down the differences. I think the more subtle thing is to appreciate that there are different emphases in different traditions. And so the way seeking and truth seeking distinction, it's more that in the West, it's the truth seeking aspect of philosophy which has come to be the most important. Perhaps in ancient Greece it wasn't. Perhaps in ancient Greece the way seeking thing was most important. Whereas certainly in China, the way-seeking thing has always been paramount, and there has been a relative lack of interest in sort of truth for its own sake, if you like.
I have to admit that when I was reading this, I'd have the reaction, the Western reaction of thinking, well, that's all very well, but that's not what I call philosophy. And then every time you took me into subject. I'm like, well, I see what you mean. And, you know, and for instance, you say certain Asian philosophies have their philosophy in poetry. And we think, well, poetry. But then again, I think, well, Wittgenstein, Nietzsche, all that aphoristic writing, we have a tradition. And that's one of your big themes, isn't it? That cut and dried, they're not divided perfectly. That it's that emphasis of where we look for.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly right. So the line I always quote, I always end up talking about this whenever I talk about the book. I always quote Tom Kasoulis, who's a very good comparative philosopher, who says in terms of like what's background in one culture is foreground in the other, and vice versa. And that's what you got to look out for. But I think the other point you were saying about having that reaction of I'm not really sure, etc., etc. You know, I think one shouldn't imagine that the end result is to sort of admire and like every single tradition equally. That would be undiscriminating, actually. Yes. At the end of the day, you have to kind of make your decisions. And I think different people will find different traditions more or less attractive.
Well, you say that, but this was one of the things I keep coming back to, because you present us with all sorts of issues that we might take on board in some Eastern philosophies, how they look to respected or intuitive thinkers rather than somebody who's analytical, as we would in the West. And I keep a bit of my gorge rises, and I keep wanting to say, but you need some criterion for deciding which of these intuitive seers or mystics has got the point. Now, having said that, of course, this is what I'm talking about with your book. I then can see that what your response might be is that, well, it's not individualistic. The community will figure out who you'd respect, who you'd admire. Whereas from my Western point of view, I want to make the decision. I want to decide who I'm going to give the authority to.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, the aspect of the ideas of seers who have sort of mystical insight is something that I personally have the most difficulty with. I can try and sympathetically understand where it comes from, but I can't ultimately buy into it. But I think that even when what I find so useful about this is that even when you end up not ultimately agreeing, having that different light shone on your own tradition does make you see your own things in different ways. And I think that you picked up one of them very well there, which is you come to realise just how much the Western tradition emphasises the autonomous personal intellect, and how much that's actually a little bit absurd in a way, because we are all products of our cultures. We think what we do largely because of what our culture has taught us and how the culture thinks, and we never approach anything in a vacuum. And I think that's a really useful and sort of chastening thing to remind yourself of, the extent to which we are all rooted in our communities and can't escape them in a way. I mean, you can learn to gain a certain distance on your own tradition. You can learn to be more objective about it. But by the time you're a fully formed intellect looking at the world, so much of the fundamentals about the way you look at things are kind of set. So it's a very good check against the kind of hubris of thinking, well, my tradition has basically got it right, and the others have basically got it wrong.
Well, yeah, of course, because well, actually, that was another response I had, because when we talk about philosophy, of course, we tend to think of it as being one kind of thing, and you're trying to open the word up a little bit. I wondered if the word wisdom might not have been a useful one to introduce, because whether that's what you're looking for or what we're unpacking in these Eastern philosophies.
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons why I was probably reluctant.
Probably
one reason I was quite reluctant to do that. One is that there is this tendency to talk about wisdom traditions in a way which kind of degrades them. It's sort of like there's proper philosophy and then there are kind of wisdom traditions. So there's
fakiness. It's all fakey, yeah.
So there's that history of that. I think the other aspect is that it kind of perhaps overstates the extent to which, the way-seeking, truth-seeking distinction. Because if you take Indian philosophy, for example, in some ways you can say it's a wisdom tradition. On the other hand, it has got a very rich, developed logic, and how does logic fit into a wisdom tradition in that sense? And, and there are kind of, broadly speaking, metaphysical views in other strands of philosophy as well. Taoism has its ideas of perpetual change and flux and so forth. And although, that's always kind of to be discovered in the name of wisdom in a way. It doesn't kind of just purely reduce to the wisdom aspect. So I think it's that. I think I can see what you're saying, but my reluctance to do that is because there's this history of using that term to kind of somehow
dismiss
they're kind
the,
of mystical, sagey type stuff, not philosophy. So just thinking about it all as variants of philosophy, it's more sort of equalising, I think.
Well, then let's look at that question of the diversity. I think most of us who give it any thought know what Western philosophy is, but one of the valuable things I get out of your book is to see the distinctions between Indian, Chinese, African, Islamic, and all. So can we unpack that a little bit, and can you take us on a quick
tour?
Well, for instance,
yeah.
I'm going to start you off
Okay.
with Chinese. It tends not to be to do with another world. It's not to do with religion.
Yes,
So
true, yeah.
You make clear.
Yes.
Whereas some of the other traditions.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Chinese philosophy is extremely interesting, and the classical Chinese philosophy, going back to Confucius and Mencius, but also the Taoist thinkers Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi. It's a very, very rich tradition, a very continuous tradition as well. I mean, like for thousands of years, people have continued in the same broad vein. And that's a remarkable continuity. I think that's partly why people think of Confucianism as a religion, because it has that kind of unifying role that
But it's not a
Christianism,
religion.
but it's not a religion at all. Exactly. What's very interesting about it is that it's broadly speaking what you call naturalistic. It doesn't really have much interest in the supernatural. Now, there is talk of the way of heaven. The way of heaven is a phrase that is used, but I mean, really, it's not any kind of idea of a purposive thing, a kind of intelligent God or creator,
Or even
It's-
another place.
No,
It's
no,
heaven
exactly.
is the wrong word.
Exactly.
I think the word is tian.
Tian. That's right.
In
so
Chinese.
it's more like the idea of nature has a kind of an order. Nature has a kind of way, and following the way of heaven is basically to live in accordance with nature in that sense. And I think that's very interesting because one of the reasons why people often dismiss non-Western philosophy as not philosophy is that they say, it's too tied up with religion. So they look at Indian.
We're going to come to that.
Yeah, so Indian philosophy, true. I mean, it's very much tied up with religion.
Islamic philosophy.
Islamic philosophy is the clues in the name. But actually, Chinese philosophy, it just really isn't. I mean, arguably, the most naturalistic tradition of thought in the world is the Chinese one, not the Western one. The Western one, for large parts of its history, have been very deeply infused with religion. I mean, Plato talked about the gods, and when you study Plato today in university, they just sort of tend to skip over that. They tend to treat those mentions of the gods as sort of like
And
metaphorical
even worse,
flourishes.
Even worse, your medieval Christians
Yeah.
co-opted Plato and tried to turn him into a proto-Christian,
Well,
which
exactly.
does him an enormous damage. But I still have quite a lot of problem with Plato.
Yeah, well, I have
Plato's
problems with
ideas.
Plato too, yeah. But also, Descartes, Locke, I mean, a lot of these canonical thinkers were very deeply religious, and their religion clearly did inform their thinking. But, we don't talk of them as Christian philosophers. We sort of bracket off the religion because our narrative, the narrative we want to have, is that philosophy is a secular discipline. And in fact, it's only been secular for a relatively short period of time, I think. Purely so, anyway.
So then we've gone to religion, which is, again, a part of my resistance to this sort of world philosophy thing, that so much of it, leaving aside China, is involved with religion. And the cards on the table, I'm a pretty straightforward materialist atheist. So I have a real problem with a philosophy which springs out of religion and whose purpose is to bolster religion. So let's talk about Islamic philosophy, where you quote people saying that it has to spring from the faith. It has to, and the Quran being the final revealed word of God means that all philosophy can be nothing more than an interpretation of that. Well, my hackles are bound to rise at that point, and that's going to create a resistance to looking at these things as what we would think, or what I would think of as proper philosophy.
Yeah, I think that with the case of Islamic philosophy, now again, some people don't like to use that term. They would say philosophy in the Islamic world, because as soon as you call it Islamic philosophy, then it seems to be owned by the religion. But actually, I think Islamic philosophy is probably more accurate, to be honest. There is, even Avicenna, who's the greatest philosopher of the
great
Islamic
thinker, yeah.
Golden Age, who clearly was a very clever philosopher and said interesting things and was developing Aristotelian ideas. It was always within the framework of the religion, in the same kind of way as the medieval scholastic philosophers were in the West. But I think this is somewhat contentious, but I don't think completely so. There is a sense in which, in the Islamic world, philosophy has never separated itself from religion, and even hasn't even managed to distance itself from religion very much. And that does make it extremely difficult to approach as a non-Muslim, I think. I'm sure that if you study these texts very, very carefully, you'll find contributions to perennial philosophical debates which are worth looking at and are interesting. So I'm glad that some people are looking at them for non-theological reasons. But it's so wrapped up with that I think unless you're going to be very determined to dig away at it, it's just simply not going to, life is short and life is finite. If you're not a believer in that faith, you have to sort of unpack a lot of the theology before you can get to any philosophical gems,
But
alas.
This then is going to lead us on to another important question. And I'm going to preface it by saying, we referred earlier to the way of living as opposed to the way of knowing things. And actually, I remember in Karen Armstrong's book, The Case for God, she actually suggests that Christianity lost its way when it stopped being the way you live and started trying to be a system of thought. And she's absolutely right about that. I think Christianity made a terrible mistake trying to take on the Enlightenment at its own game. But what that does take me to is it unreasonable of us? Is it wrong of us? And again, here I am from my perspective, to ask, are such things true? I mean, if you're talking about Allah, God, or or the Indian pantheon, is it wrong to want to have a scientific question? Are these things true or not? Obviously, you could live your life according to them without it sort of interfering with getting on with your life. But is it delinquent to wonder if there is such a thing as truth?
No, not at all. I think it's far from delinquent. It's actually essential. I don't think you could be properly philosophical without having an interest in that question. The point is, though, the reason it gets complicated is that sometimes with that excessively sort of scientific worldview, which becomes scientistic, people end up. Yeah. So I'll use the word scientistic. I think it is that worldview whereby actually it's not just that science is great and it's very powerful. It's that you end up saying that the only meaningful questions are scientific questions, and if something doesn't have a scientific answer, it's just like a pseudo question. Now, I think that's not true. In terms of religion, you've always got to. I think you do have to ask the question very clearly: what kind of claims are you making, which are essentially kind of scientific claims, and what aren't you? And you need to be clear about that, because Karen Armstrong, I'd love Karen Armstrong to be right. I just suspect that she's actually describing the ideal religion the way she would like it to be and the way it should be. I'm not sure she's actually describing the way religion certainly is, or even has been through most of its history. Most religions, in Christianity in particular, has made what are kind of factual claims about historical events and events to come in a future life. But it also does a lot of other things. So in a sense, that's where the philosophy of religion comes in. If you're to make sense of religion, part of what you have to do is try and disentangle claims about what is true or false empirically, factually, and other kinds of claims about how we ought to live, best way to live, orient ourselves to the universe, and so forth. Those kind of questions of value, I just don't think are scientific in the same way. There is no science of right and wrong. There's a science of pain and pleasure, and there's a science of the evolution of moral belief and so forth. There's a science of how the brain works. But actually, ultimately determining what is good, what is bad, right or wrong, that's not a scientific question. It's a different kind of question.
No, I'll tell you what kind of question it is. It's a cultural question. And for me, that's the distinction. Of course, not all important questions are scientific. Some are cultural, and that brings us back, doesn't it, to what your book's about in a way, because these are different cultural approaches to how to think about life and the world. And
Well, yes, but if you say it's cultural, I suppose I want to know exactly what you mean by that. Because if by cultural you mean it's something which only emerges because there are such things as humans in society, that's right. But if by cultural you
that
mean,
is what I mean.
If by cultural you mean, which you may not mean, that these things are the answers to these questions are completely relative to the historical contingencies of the culture you're in, I don't think that is true. Now, I think that what is true is that, as a matter of fact, different cultures have tended to highlight certain things and overlook others, and that's why there's diversity. But the idea that that ultimately you can't settle issues of right or wrong because of cultural diversity is far too pessimistic. And actually, what you can learn, we can actually, there's a lot of overlap in cultures for a start, and things are framed in different ways, but the amount of potential agreement is extremely huge. The UN's Universal Declaration on Human Rights is a very good example of this, because people will often say, "Oh, rights, it's that Western thing, isn't it? Yeah, it's a Western ideal. They don't have rights elsewhere." Well, when they were putting together that charter, they found that it wasn't a hard sell to the non-Western countries as a whole. The hard sell was to the communist countries, actually, and South Africa, I believe. But a lot of the developing world and Asia were perfectly happy with this. The language of rights may not have been in their vernacular, but they could understand them in such a way that they could fit them into their worldview. And so, again, I think that when you actually dig away, you find that there's quite a lot of possibility for a lot more common ground than we might think. That's got to be the hope.
There's one more thing I want to touch on, which is the relationship of the individual to all of these matters. And you have a nice distinction between intimacy, integrity.
Another borrowed one, yeah.
And yet,
all the best stuff stolen.
It was new to me. So and you opened my up a little bit there. So can you give us a quick overview of that, of what that distinction is?
Well, I mean, it's one of the most useful ones I came across, and again, it's owes it again to Tom Kasoulis, who I mentioned earlier. Now, this again, it's to do with sort of orientations of thinking, which really affect everything pretty much, but perhaps it's clearest in the example of how we conceive of ourselves. So, I think his choice of terms is perhaps slightly unfortunate because it's not intuitive, but you can get there. By integrity, we don't mean this idea of moral integrity. Think of integrity in the sense of an object having integrity, meaning it is entire to itself. It needs nothing else. So it's separate and discrete. So in the sort of the dominant Western way of thinking for the last few hundred years at least, has been this integrity culture whereby the way we think about ourselves and everything is as discrete individual entities, which are only secondarily in relations to each other. So in science, it's the reduction to the atom and the subatomic particle. In nutrition, it's breaking things down to proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins. It's that nutrientist approach of trying to sort of break things down. And in terms of individuals, the individual is the fundamental unit of society. It goes back to the idea of Descartes and his cogito ergo sum. You are an individual thinking, indivisible entity. Society is a collection of these things. So in a way, the person who summed up this view most accurately was that famous philosopher Margaret Thatcher, who said, you may remember there's no such thing as society. There are only individuals, men and women, families, and so forth. And, people often say, oh, well, she wasn't really saying there's no such thing as society. She was simply making a point that society is what happens when these different elements come together. But that's precisely the point. That is the integrity orientation. Now, the intimacy orientation sees the foregrounded thing here is that actually nothing exists in isolation. Things are only what they are because of how they stand in relations to other things. So in a way, there is no such thing as the individual human being, because there are no human beings without there being a species of human beings. There's no being the individual you are without being a member of a particular family, a community, and so forth. And it also develops in science as well, actually. Interestingly enough, a lot of the most recent developments in science have been to kind of balance that reductionist integrity way of looking at things, to look more at the way systems behave. So systems biology, for example, and complexity theory. Now, I think these are really important because the thing is, they're kind of like two ways of looking at the world which they're not mutually exclusive, right? And there are times where it's very beneficial to adopt one, and there are times when it's very beneficial to adopt the other. And probably all of us need both, and we do all of us use both. So again, although the dominant way of thinking in the West is to do with the individual, when we lose someone close to ourselves, it's very common to say, I've lost a part of me. And that's a way of thinking which is more to do with the intimacy way of thinking, that thing of us being fundamentally interconnected. And so once you sort of start seeing things in those terms, it becomes very, very useful. And I think it helps you to sort of recognize the extent to which we kind of systematically focus too much on the integrity aspect and sort of miss the elements of intimacy, which is, if I know I'm going on, but I think it's actually politically important as well, because people often complain that the problem with society today is it's become too individualistic, etc., etc. And I think that's partly true. But it's not about giving up our ideas of individuality. It's about recognizing the other side of the coin.
You have a beautiful illustrative example of this. You say that when you show a picture to Americans, they see what's in the foreground. But if you show it to the Japanese, they'll see the background a lot more than Americans will, because the relations between things matter more in their culture.
Yeah, this is work in psychology. It's not like all these things. There are people who can test it, but I must admit, when I'm fairly persuaded of this. Yeah, it just seems that the attention to foreground, the elements at the front, is just something that people notice much more. And in Japanese, and it's purely cultural. There's nothing biological about it. So if you're born Japanese parents, grow up in America, you have the American way of looking at things, and vice versa.
Well, Julian, you have expanded my horizons, and for that, I'm extremely grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking.
The book is How the World Thinks, A Global History of Philosophy by Julian Baggini, and it's Granter, and it's £20. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.
That was the Books Podcast with Tim Haig. The Books Podcast is produced by Green Shoot. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.